Hello, everyone. This is John from RPGs and More. And in today's episode, I wanted to talk to you about a topic that I kind of mentioned in brief in one of my more recent videos. And it kind of has been something that I've been off and on working on and thinking about over several years now. And that is using 54 millimeter miniatures for games like Dungeons and Dragons and other role playing games. Now, for those of you who are not aware, the standard size, well, what I think is the standard size of a miniature that's being used for D&D right now and other role playing games is 28 millimeter. Now, that means that it's from the bottom of the foot to the level of the eyes, you can measure 28 millimeters on a ruler or a tape measure. And that has kind of been the standard for the last, I want to say, 20 years. Some companies make their figures a little bigger, some companies actually make their figures slightly smaller. There's plastic figures in this, there's metal figures in this, and there's also a lot of people making figures in resin and selling them on Etsy and things like that. So that's kind of where a lot of this stuff goes, and it's also a very common scale in wargaming right now. Especially 28 millimeter heroic scale is being used in things like uh, Warhammer: The Old World, in addition to some historical scaled miniatures. And you've got companies like Warlord make a lot of 28 millimeter miniatures. You've got companies like Reaper, like War Games Atlantic, North North Star Miniatures. There's so much. It's a huge portion of the market. But it's not the only miniature scale out there. There's also 10 millimeter, 15 millimeter, and we used to be 20 millimeter, and then 25 millimeter, and now there's a lot of people starting to use 32 millimeter miniatures. So there's a lot of variation. But one of the more common scales that used to be available a lot more is 54 millimeter or 1/32 scale, not to be confused with 32 millimeters, not the same. So 1/32, 1/32 scale is the same roughly as 54 millimeter miniature. Now, typically, figures at that size are being sold more as small statuettes or pieces for dioramas for people who are really into that part of the hobby. And you can kind of see why. I actually have a figure here. So this is, I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to see if I can get the camera to focus on it here. This is a standard, there we go, standard 28 millimeter miniature. This is from Reaper. So that's what you can kind of expect. And then this is a 54 millimeter miniature from the same company. They actually have that same figure, but I don't have a copy of them right now, so I can't use it. All right, so you kind of see the difference in size and scale. And if the camera is focusing properly, you can see the difference in detail. I'm going to set those down now. So 54 millimeter scale allows for a lot more detail on the miniature, but it also allows for a lot more space for you to do freehand on areas where there isn't detail. So if you're the kind of person that likes the idea of painting fancy cloaks or patterns on clothing and things like that, then 54 millimeters is a pretty cool size to go for. However, getting miniatures in 54 millimeters is actually a little on the difficult side. Well, that's not true. that's easy if you want cheap plastic figures, because that's more or less the scale that is was used for a long time for those green army men that you would get in the big bins over at the toy store when you're a kid. And a lot of that stuff is still available. So that's an interesting thing, because in historical gaming, there are still plenty of people that will game in 54 millimeter. It does require a lot of extra big terrain pieces and sometimes a larger board size, although sometimes they just play smaller actions on the same size board. So it's be great for skirmish gaming. But why would we want to use this for D&D? Well, partially because the larger size of the miniature does allow for more detail, which is kind of nice. It also allows for, well, someone who has a visual impairment to be able to kind of see where all the miniatures are and display their own art and artistry a little bit more. At least that's my theory. And I'm working on, as I just showed you, I have some 54 millimeter metal miniatures that I got from Reaper Miniatures. So I picked up the whole line of 54 millimeter miniatures that they have, that they provide, which is not much. It was like 4 or 5 figures, 4 figures. So I think there was one more that I didn't get, but that's because it was really just not appropriate to the era. Anyway, I have tried using the plastic figures before, the ones that are more readily available. And they're interesting, but for the life of me, I could not get paint to stay on them. I tried every technique that I researched that was recommended for them, which was, scrubbing them with a great soap, making sure that you're very abrasive with the brush, things like that. And then that would help the paint stick. But it did just, sometimes it would stick to the bodies, but like the swords, it would just flake right off and go right back to base plastic, and that was not fun. So eventually I did that project about 2 years ago, where I dove a little deeper into that one, and I painted up about 5 figures, and I had some fun with it. It was, pretty cool. But in the end, it wasn't what I really wanted, and the materials weren't doing the things that I wanted them to do, and so I kind of got rid of that project. Now I'm revisiting it again, but instead of doing the plastics, um, because no one makes, until recently, people didn't really make uh, plastic 54 millimeter miniatures in the kind of plastic and sprues that you see our 28 millimeter miniatures on. That's starting to change because Wargames Atlantic has a series of miniatures that they're making for Sharps rifles, kind of that's based on those characters from the Sharps rifles series. And they include a 28 millimeter miniature and a 54 millimeter miniature in each box. So I'm going to be picking up those at some point to give them a try and to support Wargames Atlantic for it. Even though I don't normally play Napoleonic games, that might be fun. The downside is you don't really get to customize those miniatures, the plastic ones. But, that's fine because I don't really get to customize the metal ones that I'm getting either. All right. But that's part of what I'm exploring right now. So you can also get a lot of historical miniatures in metal at 54 millimeter. And that's kind of where I'm leaning if I go anywhere outside of what Reaper has. And I'm going to explore that. But you got to be very careful because some of the figures are the old lead miniatures. So you got to be kind of careful about which ones you're buying and making sure that you're getting something that's made a little more recently, though it's a bit more tin than lead. And that's something that I'm still figuring out. I do know that there's also a lot of resin that you can get if you want to get resin miniatures in that scale. You go to eBay, and I found probably half a dozen sellers that will scale their miniatures anywhere from like 15 millimeter up to 75 millimeter for your purchasing pleasures. And they all do their stuff in 3D printed resin. I haven't ordered any of that yet, so I can't speak as to whether they're actually worth the money. And it's not a small amount of money. Six figures will run you, $60. You're looking at usually around, for the resin ones, about $10 a miniature. For the metal ones, it's about 20, unless you go for like the really high end stuff or the really old stuff, in which case you're looking at like $30 and $40 per miniature. Another option is I did do some research on this tonight. I spent some time messing with Hero Forge. And I have never ordered anything through Hero Forge. I have gotten like a couple of STL files that I 3D printed myself, and they were okay. But I ordered from, I went through Hero Forge, and I was able to find out that you can technically make a miniature in 54 millimeter if you really like it. You're not supposed to. Basically, they officially cap their sizing chart at 40 millimeters. But if you mess with the custom settings on your miniatures, you can actually elongate the torso and a bunch of other stuff in order to make the miniature just stand a bit taller. Proportions look weird, unfortunately. It doesn't, I don't know. I'm not as sold on that one, but it is possible. And the upside is, well, that's not really an upside, but you're looking at about 60 some $70 per miniature to get a custom made high quality 3D printed plastic miniature from Hero Forge. And that's the high quality plastic that doesn't show the layer lines of 3D printing, or at least they're barely visible, not the cheap one. The cheap one is the visible layer lines, is what they've said, and I'm trying to avoid that. So I did not order the miniature, not yet. I may do that next month, we'll see. But that's another way to get them technically and get them customized to what you want. The downside is it's expensive. It's very expensive. And I'm not sure that I'm really interested in pursuing that angle because it's so expensive. But there's no chance of there being lead, and it's not resin. So terrain is an interesting thing, though. You can actually get, I've discovered, 54 millimeter terrain. There's two ways. You go for actual 54 millimeter terrain. A lot of it is based on Napoleonic era, because that's where a lot of the miniatures that were 54 millimeter have been made for, is for Napoleonics. So you can get it. It's expensive. Well, not crazy expensive, though. I'd say it's about on par with getting terrain for 28 millimeter. Just, you don't get as much per purchase, but you get a good amount to do what you want to do. There's a lot in there for the 3D printers that sell stuff on eBay. You can get a lot of stuff through them. So that's not unreasonable. I can even get, if I want to pay a couple $100s, I can even get a whole castle at that scale. That's like, it's like 3D printed, and you can assemble all the different rooms or take it apart and whatnot. And that's kind of neat. And maybe someday I'll do that if I decide that I want to be that kind of person to have a big ginormous castle playset in my house. But I'm not there yet. So that's kind of, but the other things you can do is you can make your own terrain. And a lot of that requires the same skills that we would use for making terrain for 28 millimeter miniatures. We're talking using foam board, in order to kind of make details for the walls. You can get various wooden bases in order to make the bases for your terrain. I did pick up some clay bricks from a hobby shop the other day, and they were the kinds that are designed for people that like to build their own sets for doll houses, basically, uh, and dioramas. And they might work. And I picked up some flooring pieces just to see what I can do with that. And we'll see. I'll get my tools out and try to make a couple of, I guess, a set piece for that and see if I can have some fun with it. It's a neat idea, and I'm certainly gonna enjoy trying it out. But we'll see how it works. It's I think what it is it's a nice challenge. If you have gone as far as you want to go with 20 millimeter guys and you want to challenge your hobby skills, and you can try 54 millimeter. But the reality is, and this is the hard part that I don't like really admitting, is the fact that there's just not a lot of options out there. There's a small amount of historical options in the metal miniatures. There's a large amount of options in plastic. And there's even some hard plastic miniatures that you can get that are historical and fantasy. But those come from Russia. So getting them here in the States, while not impossible, is a little interesting right now. And I'm not going to really support that, so I won't talk about that any further at this time. But there's a lot of like cheap plastic, and that's the bendy plastic, a lot of that available. So there's options to do this if that's what you want to do, but you have to be interested in most of the historical periods that the figures are made in. So for fantasy, when I did a search for fantasy miniatures, what I ran into a lot was actually kind of what I would describe as fantasy pinups, where the women are in rather interesting poses, and many of them were wearing rather interesting lack of clothing, um, and that's not really what I wanted. So I kind of just let that one slide away out of my view. But it is kind of what I ran into a lot. And so if you have good hobby skills and good modeling skills, and you don't mind the idea of, say, sculpting clothing onto some of these basically armatures that you can pick up, then those are actually some pretty cool options, because you can actually really make it your own, and then your princess or your sorceress will never look like anybody else's, because you literally sculpted the clothing and the capes and the cloaks and whatnot yourself. And that might actually be easier than making clothing for 28 millimeter miniatures, because with the bigger scale, there's slightly more forgiveness if what you're making ends up being a little thicker than it needs to be. So I may try that at some point. But because the options are so limited, because it is not something that is ready made, it is something that is more demanding of the hobbyist than doing stuff in 28 millimeter. And I'm not interested in abandoning 28 millimeter at this point, because it is easy. It's easy to get figures for it, and you can get big collections of a lot of different monsters and stuff, whereas at 54 millimeter, things are harder to get. And the stories you'd end up telling would be almost by definition either theater of the mind, with the miniature just there to show what you got, what your person looks like, or it would be very dark, probably low fantasy, maybe even dark fantasy related stuff. Low fantasy, low magic, where you've got Normans and Vikings teaming up to fight against, I don't know, Celts or something like that, or vice versa. Switch all these factions around. You could probably get something nice going up there. Which, if you're into historical role-playing games, might actually be up your alley. But I found it an interesting mental exercise, and I had spent enough time trying this over the past couple of years that I thought it was worth actually doing a full video on just the concept of 54 millimeters in D&D, because I've been searching online for YouTube videos on this topic and I haven't found any. Um, I mean, I found stuff for wargaming, and that's cool, and I think those channels are pretty neat. But I haven't found much for actual using it for fantasy. So that's part of the inspiration for this. And maybe I'll talk more about it in the future as I progress with this project. And maybe the end result's going to be I'll finish up with my current stage in the project, paint up the miniatures that I have, and say, you know, I'm good and I'm done and I don't want to do this anymore. And go back to just doing 20 millimeter, and that'll be fine. And maybe that'll be the video, just telling you, hey, it's not worth pursuing. But at the moment, I want to pursue it, and I want to see if it's something that we can make, or at least I can make into a viable thing, because I think it's interesting, especially for people that get really attached to their characters, to have something that is really custom and really theirs. And that's something that you can do with 54 millimeter, especially if the thing with Hero Forge works out. That is a lot harder to do with, well, not harder. You can do it with 28 millimeter. You can do it really well if you have a really robust bits box and you're making plastic minis. Shout out to Peachy Tips and a few other channels out there that just do amazing work, and I love watching their stuff. So, can be done. You can get a lot of stuff done with 28 millimeter miniatures. This is no knock on 20 millimeters at all. I just think, I imagine that 54 millimeter will be an interesting canvas, and it's why I kind of wanted to talk about it. But we'll see how it goes, like I said. The question would come in, what system would you use for that? And it's easy and it's hard, because the easy answer would be some variant of D&D. But the difficulty of that is that in D&D, it's not uncommon to be facing off against, you say, like 9 different goblins, or 9 different, giant metal-clad beetles, or clockwork beetles, or 12 orcs, whatnot. And getting that many unique miniatures in this scale is a little more challenging. It takes a little bit more time. It takes more time to paint them and get them ready for the table, things like that. So it might not be a great fit. So you'd want a system that would support like highly detailed character creation, but also would support sort of more unique challenges, where you can embrace, say, environmental challenges in addition to just combat. But also, when you're fighting, you're not fighting like 20 of something, but maybe 1 or 2 of a certain thing. And so I would actually think that a Cypher system would be a good call for that, because there's so much variability in the Cypher system when it comes to character creation. You can customize everything about your character, which means you can really make them your own, or you can make them match the miniature. And there's some cool options there, and I kind of like that. But it's not perfect. Well, that's not true. It is really, like, it's almost 100% perfect for this sort of thing, because the way that the challenge system in Cypher scales, the way that all the numbers scale, it allows you to have cool one-on-one encounters where your players are leaving everything out on the table. They're putting it all out there. They're doing everything that they can against this encounter, and nothing's a pushover. You can do a lot of engaging with the environment, and And even that will drain resources, character resources from the game as you go. So it kind of can make environmental play feel more interesting because it does more than just become like a hit point tax when you're talking about traps or a barrier to adventure if you're talking about like puzzles or wilderness encounters and things like that. So that's a system that would work for that. Do it pretty well. Otherwise, I would probably go for something like GURPS for the same reasons, really, because it is even more number crunchy and high detail than Cipher System. I haven't played GURPS in almost 20 years, so I can't really say that I remember everything too well, but I do remember having a good time with it. So that would be something that you could look into. Another one, honestly, if I wanted to go low rule count, small stuff, I would be tempted to break out Sword and Backpack for that sort of thing. The reason why is because Sword and Backpack is a very simple system. There's not a lot of rules, but what that means is there's a lot of flexibility. So if you want to have, say, a character who is a dragon sorceress with a pet dragon that rides on her shoulder, because that's one of the miniatures that I picked up from Reaper, and also has a dragon that follows her around like a Saint Bernard, then there's nothing in Sword and Backpack saying you can't do that. You just talk the story out with the game master, and or if you're running it solo with yourself, and voila, done. Because there's not a whole lot of stuff to balance in that system. And I'll do another video talking about Sword and Backpack as a system because I actually have been having a few thoughts about it over the past week while I've been working. And there's a few things I kind of like, and there's some things that are, well, yeah, but that's kind of the nature of any game system. So we'll get into that then. But anyway, that's another one that I was thinking about for the 54 millimeter guys, but we'll see what ends up actually happening. Anyway, I've been doing a lot of play testing, not play testing, but running solo games for myself and working on those stories. So when those are ready to go, I'll start putting them up on the channel. I realized when I was doing the Chivalry and Passion series, I realized that I had made a mistake partially through, and there's a few plot points that I had dropped accidentally, which make the latter half of the game make a lot less sense. And so I'm a little embarrassed about it. I'm not sure if I'm going to put them up at this point. We'll see if I can get the personal lack of embarrassment to actually put all that up. But it's interesting. I basically, yeah, I'll get into that if the time comes. But I've got another story that I'm working on that is actually really cool, and that's using the White Box Cyclopedia. And that one, we're keeping everything very tightly controlled, learning from my mistakes and things like that. And the story is much better so far. Knock on wood. We'll try to keep it that way. But that's some stuff you can look forward to in the future. And if I come up with any other ideas of something that like, hey, I want to talk about this, I'll put a video up about it. It's just interesting, and I enjoy thinking about different stuff for the hobby. And sometimes I get a hair up, and I decide I need to really research something, and that's kind of what happened with this 54 millimeter stuff. And figured, you know what? I've got all this knowledge that I've stored in my head. Why not put it out there? Uh, so uh, basically, to sum it all up, yes, you can get the figures in metal. Metal seems to be the most reliable material. The best source at this point is Reaper Miniatures. Uh, at least they're the ones that are selling it at retail that I can find. But they only have about 4 or 5 figures that are in that size and scale, so you better be really good at customizing with green stuff if you want to have a more varied adventuring party. And there's resin figures you can get off of eBay. They're they're okay, I'm sure. I just personally don't like resin. If you want to do bases for these guys, the thing that I would recommend actually is 40 millimeter round bases or poker chips. If you get the big poker chips from the hard clay ones that have a metal core, those are also a good one. But if you do the plastic bases, then you can put magnets on the bottom of them. You can use pinning to pin them to the base without having to worry about breaking the ceramic and the metal core and things like that. So I generally recommend the 40 millimeter rounds. They seem to have the best reaction for anything that I've been doing. And don't be afraid to pin. You want to pin those joints and or use copious amounts of your favorite super glue. I prefer Gorilla myself, but your mileage may vary. And have fun if you want to do this, or watch me suffer if you don't. It's all good. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this was at least interesting. And who knows, maybe we'll start a 54 millimeter revolution and suddenly companies will want to put a product out there. I don't know. Or maybe not. Either way, I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Peace be with you. Bye bye.